Scary telling.
I had always known my dog Buddy to be a little anxious. Whenever he was nervous, he would start licking his paws. It was something he had done since he was a puppy. So when I heard him noisily licking something the other day, I didn't think much of it at first. But then I noticed something strange. Buddy wasn't just licking the air, he was fixated on something in front of him. As I approached him, I saw two spherical clumps of peanut butter hovering in front of his face. They were just hanging there, as if suspended in midair. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There was no way that peanut butter could just float like that. I tried to call Buddy away, but he wouldn't budge. It was as if he was entranced by the peanut butter. I knew I had to investigate, but my curiosity quickly turned to fear when I realized that the peanut butter was not alone. There was something sinister lurking in the shadows. I cautiously approached the peanut butter, my heart pounding with fear. As I got closer, the peanut butter began to move. The clumps writhed and squirmed like living creatures. I recoiled in horror as I realized what they were, the eyes of a malevolent spirit. The peanut butter had been possessed by the ghost of a woman who had died tragically in the house years before. I had heard stories of strange occurrences in the house, but I had always dismissed them as superstition. Now, faced with the reality of the paranormal, I felt my skepticism melting away. Buddy continued to lick the air, seemingly oblivious to the ghostly presence. I knew I had to act fast to protect him and myself from harm. But what could I do against a vengeful spirit? I decided to consult a spiritual expert, someone who could help me understand what was happening and how to stop it. As I left the kitchen, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The ghostly presence had made itself known, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it grew stronger and more dangerous. I had to find a way to banish it from my home, or risk being trapped in its grip forever. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off in the house. Doors would creak open and shut on their own, and strange noises echoed through the halls. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but deep down, I knew that the ghostly presence was growing stronger. One night, I was awakened by a loud crash. I jumped out of bed and rushed to the kitchen, where I found the cabinets had been thrown open and their contents scattered across the floor. And there, in the midst of the chaos, were the peanut butter clumps, now moving on their own. I watched in horror as they floated across the room, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. It was as if they had a life of their own, controlled by the vengeful spirit that had possessed them. I knew then that I had to take action. I decided to try to communicate with the spirit, hoping that I could reason with it and convince it to leave my home. I sat down at the kitchen table and addressed the spirit, my voice shaking with fear. "Please, leave us alone," I said. "We mean you no harm. We just want to live our lives in peace." But the spirit did not respond. Instead, it grew more hostile. The lights flickered and the temperature dropped, and I could feel a cold, damp wind blowing through the kitchen. I knew then that I had made a grave mistake. By acknowledging the spirit, I had given it power. And now, it was determined to drive us out of our home. I tried to leave the kitchen, but the ghostly presence seemed to follow me. It was as if it was everywhere, a dark cloud hanging over my head. I could feel its eyes on me, watching my every move. Days turned into weeks, and the haunting only grew more intense. I could hear strange noises in every room of the house, and I knew that the ghostly presence was getting stronger. It was as if it was feeding on my fear, growing more powerful with every passing day. I began to feel trapped in my own home, unable to escape the vengeful spirit that had taken over. And worst of all, Buddy was starting to show signs of distress. He would bark at nothing, his eyes fixed on some unseen entity. I knew then that I had to find a way to protect us both, before it was too late. As the haunting grew more intense, I found myself becoming increasingly fearful and anxious. I could feel the ghostly presence everywhere, and I knew that it was becoming more and more powerful with each passing day. Buddy, too, was starting to show signs of distress. He would cower in fear at the slightest sound, and his once playful demeanor had turned into one of constant unease. I knew I had to find a way to protect him, as well as myself. I decided to seek out the help of a spiritual expert, someone who could help me understand what was happening and how to stop it. I scoured the internet for hours, searching for someone with the right expertise. Finally, I came across a woman named Jane who claimed to have experience dealing with vengeful spirits. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if it was worth risking my safety to call her. But I knew I had no other choice. When I called Jane, I explained this situation to her. She listened patiently, then told me that she would come over and investigate the house. The day of Jane's arrival, I could feel the tension mounting. Buddy was barking at the door, his tail between his legs. I tried to calm him down, but my own fear was beginning to get the better of me. When Jane arrived, she seemed calm and collected. She walked through the house, taking notes and muttering to herself. I could see the fear in her eyes, and I knew then that this was no ordinary haunting. After several hours of investigation, Jane came to me with her findings. "The spirit is strong," she said. "Stronger than I've ever seen. We'll have to perform an exorcism." I was hesitant at first, but I knew that I had no other choice. The haunting had become too powerful to ignore. Jane warned me that the exorcism would be dangerous, and that there was no guarantee of success. But I was desperate to rid my home of the vengeful spirit, and I was willing to do whatever it took. The day of the exorcism was filled with tension and fear. Jane had brought with her an arsenal of tools, including candles, incense, and a book of ancient chants. We sat in the kitchen, the center of the haunting, and began the ritual. As we chanted and prayed, the air grew thick with tension. I could feel the ghostly presence growing stronger, as if it was trying to fight back against our efforts. Suddenly, the candles flickered out, plunging us into darkness. The temperature dropped, and I could feel a cold, damp wind blowing through the kitchen. We continued to chant, our voices growing louder and more desperate. And then, suddenly, it was over. The ghostly presence seemed to dissipate, leaving behind an eerie silence. I knew then that we had succeeded in banishing the spirit from our home. But the victory was bittersweet. The house was in ruins, the haunting having left its mark on every corner. And worst of all, I knew that the memory of the peanut butter possession would haunt me for years to come. After the exorcism, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The haunting had finally ended, and I could feel the weight of the ghostly presence lifting from my shoulders. But the relief was short-lived. As I looked around the kitchen, I could see the damage that had been done. The cabinets were broken, the floor was littered with debris, and the walls were scuffed and scratched. It was as if a tornado had blown through the house. Jane could see the distress on my face, and she tried to reassure me. "It's over," she said. "You're safe now." But I knew that the damage had been done. The house was in ruins, and I had no idea how to begin the process of repairing it. And worst of all, the memory of the peanut butter possession lingered, a constant reminder of the horror that had taken place in my home. Over the next few days, I tried to pick up the pieces. I called in contractors to assess the damage, and I began the process of filing an insurance claim. But as I walked through the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was as if the ghostly presence had not truly left. I could feel its eyes on me, watching my every move. I knew that I had to be vigilant, or risk being drawn back into its grip. Days turned into weeks, and the house slowly began to take shape again. The contractors worked tirelessly, repairing the damage and restoring the house to its former state. But as the work continued, I could feel my anxiety growing. It was as if the ghostly presence was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it was always there, a constant reminder of what had happened. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a noise. It was a soft, whispering sound, as if someone was calling out to me. I sat up, my heart pounding with fear. And then I saw her. The ghostly presence had returned, hovering in the corner of my room. I could see the eyes of the peanut butter clumps, and I knew then that the exorcism had not truly banished the spirit from my home. I was filled with fear and panic, unsure of what to do. I knew that I couldn't face the ghostly presence alone. I had to find a way to banish it from my home, once and for all. I contacted Jane again, hoping that she could help me. When she arrived, she was shocked to see the ghostly presence still there. She told me that the exorcism had only weakened the spirit, and that a more powerful exorcism would be needed to banish it for good. We began the process of the exorcism again, this time with even greater intensity. We chanted and prayed, calling upon the power of the universe to banish the ghostly presence from my home. As we worked, I could feel the spirit growing weaker. Its eyes began to fade, and its presence began to dissipate. And then, suddenly, it was gone. The peanut butter clumps fell to the ground, and the room was filled with a sense of peace. Jane smiled at me. "It's over," she said. "You're safe now." I knew that the memory of the haunting would never truly leave me. But I also knew that I had triumphed over the ghostly presence, and that I could finally begin to move on from the horror that had taken place in my home. After the second exorcism, I felt a sense of peace that I had not felt in months. The ghostly presence had finally been banished from my home, and I could feel the weight of the haunting lifting from my shoulders. But the aftermath of the haunting was not something that I could simply brush aside. The house was in ruins, and I knew that it would take months, if not years, to repair the damage. And even once the repairs were complete, the memory of the haunting would always linger. Buddy, too, was struggling to cope with the aftermath of the haunting. He had become more anxious than ever, barking at nothing and cowering at the slightest sound. I knew that he had been traumatized by the experience, and that it would take time for him to heal. As I looked around the house, I knew that I had a difficult decision to make. Should I stay and rebuild, or should I cut my losses and move on? The thought of leaving the house behind was painful, but I knew that I could never truly feel safe there again. In the end, I decided to move on. I sold the house and started over, determined to leave the memory of the peanut butter possession behind. But even as I settled into my new home, I knew that the haunting would never truly leave me. The memory of the vengeful spirit and the peanut butter clumps would always be with me, a reminder of the horror that had taken place. Buddy, too, struggled to cope with the aftermath of the haunting. He would often wake up in the middle of the night, barking at nothing. But over time, he began to heal, and his anxiety slowly faded. As for me, I knew that I would never forget the peanut butter possession. But I also knew that I had triumphed over the ghostly presence, and that I had emerged stronger from the experience. In the end, The haunting had taught me a valuable lesson, that there are forces in this world that we cannot understand, and that we must be ever vigilant against the unknown. And though the memory of the haunting would always haunt me, I knew that I was ready to face whatever came my way, armed with the knowledge that I had faced my fears and